I'm Randy Leedy. I'm the author of the Greek New Testament sentence diagrams that first appeared in BibleWorks software in about 2005, and then more recently in PDF form, available at my website, www.ntgreekguide.com, and now also as a Logos resource. In this video, I'll be giving you a little introduction and orientation to these diagrams, along with some resources for those of you that might want to dig more deeply into sentence diagramming as an exegetical method. Here's our content for this video. We'll divide it into two parts. What are the sentence diagrams? And then part two, what good are they? Under that first part, we'll talk about the diagrams themselves, then some supporting materials, some limitations, and the Greek text editions for which the diagrams are available. You can see a bit of a sentence diagram behind that text, but let's go into Logos and look more closely at a particular diagram just to give you a feel for the kind of thing that they are. Here's a little layout that I've set up for studying the Greek New Testament with diagrams, just a Greek text at the upper right, a couple of English versions below that, and then the diagrams window to the left. We'll move the mouse over Titus 3:8 and click Show Media to look at that diagram on a larger scale. Now, a sentence diagram is just what you might call a grammatical map of a sentence. It shows how words cluster together into phrases and clauses, and how those phrases and clauses relate to one another. So to go through this diagram, just in English translation, it says something like this. The word is faithful, a complete clause of subject, verb, and complement, and a conjunction joining another clause now, and I wish you to be affirming concerning these things, in order that, and the subject phrase is a little bit longer phrase now, elevated on a stilt, in order that the ones having believed God may be careful, there's your verb, may be careful about what? To maintain good works. And then yet a third clause, coordinate with the first two, but there's no conjunction joining this third clause to the previous ones. It just stands without a conjunction. These things are, they're what? Good and profitable for men. Now, we can't go into detail on how to draw sentence diagrams. At my website, which I'll mention later with a little bit more detail, I have a link to a YouTube series of videos on how to do sentence diagramming. Here, I just want you to get the general feel of the kind of map that a diagram provides. Obviously, you need to have a little working knowledge of Greek, but you don't have to be any great Greek scholar to get profit from these diagrams. Now, to a great extent, but not completely, the grammatical structure that we see in a sentence diagram reflects the structure of the writer's thought. So the diagram clearly helps us to follow the writer's thought in detail. The main value of diagramming, of course, is the process of drawing your own diagrams. But consulting diagrams drawn by others is just as sensible and helpful as consulting commentaries on the kinds of questions that commentaries deal with. A diagram really is a form of grammatical commentary on the text, actually. And it does deal with much smaller details of the text than commentaries generally have space to treat. So you can use sentence diagrams a lot of times as a supplement to regular commentaries for those who are more interested in grammatical details. Now, there's supporting material for the sentence diagrams. Let's close this window. Let's scroll in the table of contents, and you'll notice there's an introduction to the sentence diagrams, giving some of the historical background to them. At the end, there is a document on how to draw sentence diagrams, and then an extensive discussion of the policies that I used in formulating these diagrams. Another very important kind of support material is in a separate resource. These are the grammatical notes that accompany the diagrams. This notes resource also contains those other supplementary documents that I've already mentioned, but the notes, verse by verse, are only in this notes resource. So you'll want to be well aware of that resource and make use of it. So you see here, I'm in the library browser now. There's a resource for the sentence diagrams themselves, and then another resource for the notes. You see out there to the right, after the colon, it says notes. So both of those resources will work together. You can put them in a link set so that the notes tag along with wherever you go in the diagrams. The diagrams in turn, of course, can be linked to the Greek New Testament text, so that the diagrams also move along with you through your Greek text. All right, let's close our library browser here. Now, there are some limitations to these diagrams. I've already mentioned that they require some working understanding of Greek. Also, a number of users have been disappointed at a lack of interactivity. When you pass the mouse over the Greek words in the diagrams, you don't see anything. You may be accustomed to seeing various kinds of information about the words pop up when you hover the mouse over them, but that kind of functionality would be cost prohibitive to develop for these diagrams. I mentioned already that I drew these diagrams for BibleWorks software, and the only viable method for bringing them into Logos was as simple bitmapped images that are just about the same as opening a paper book and reading what's printed on the page. So be aware that these are really for viewing only. You could make some comments on the notes resource, but the diagrams themselves can't be marked up or commented on. Now, as you would well imagine, there is some susceptibility to error here. These diagrams are not the Holy Spirit's own diagrams of the inspired text. And over time that these diagrams have been in existence, various corrections have been made, both to correct accidental errors and to revise diagrams in light of improved understanding of the text. Undoubtedly, some errors of both kinds still remain. Of course, this is what we expect to find in all kinds of exegetical literature, and these diagrams are no exception. Also, there's no one right way to diagram every passage. Often alternative diagrammings are highly viable. Sometimes my grammatical notes call attention to alternatives to the diagramming. Many of those things I had to just pass over, counting on the reader to exercise his own judgment in making those kinds of decisions. Now, I mentioned that this is available in more than one edition of the Greek New Testament. You may have noticed when I had my library browser open that there are two sets of diagrams. There's the NA28 edition. NA means Nestle Aland, so the 28th edition of the Nestle Aland Greek text. That's kind of the industry standard academic text for Greek New Testament study. That's the version in which the diagrams were originally drawn. Logos commissioned me to do an SBL Greek New Testament version of the diagrams. The SBL Greek text, which is Logos's basic Greek text, is very similar in wording to NA28, so it was not a huge task to convert the diagrams over to an SBL equivalent. I did find, though, that there were a great many punctuation differences between these two texts that caused me to revise many of the diagrams. Probably an average of somewhere between 3 and 5 diagrams per chapter had to be revised because of punctuation differences between these two texts. So I would advise, if you're using Nestle Aland 28 or the SBL Greek New Testament, either one of those as your primary Greek New Testament, I would advise that you have the set of diagrams that correspond to your Greek text in order to avoid confusion over those kinds of differences. Now, I should mention that the SBL Greek text diagrams that Logos commissioned were for the purpose of including in base packages at the silver level and above, beginning with Logos version 9. So if you have Logos version 9 or version 10, silver or above, you have the SBL Greek New Testament diagrams as part of your base package. The Nestle Aland 28 is under a different copyright arrangement that is not as, shall we say, generous, and so that is always going to be a set that is for sale as a separate add-on purchase rather than being part of a base package. Now, while I have the library browser open, just before we move on to part 2, let me mention this little book, Love Not the World, Winning the War Against Worldliness. That's a Logos title that I have authored, and that particularly those of you who are concerned about the encroachments of contemporary culture into God's church may find a great deal of help from. It's a biblical theological study and has a considerable amount of New Testament exegesis in it as well that covers some territory that you're not going to find in some other very fine writings on the topic, but this just has a stronger biblical focus than most of those writings do. I've mentioned my website, www.ntgreekguy.com. I thought we would take a quick look here. And in particular, I wanted to show you the resources page where I mentioned the series of YouTube videos, providing a link to that channel, And also there's a Facebook group for Greek New Testament diagramming, which you can easily find on Facebook by simply searching Greek diagramming. And we would be glad to have people who are interested in discussing Greek New Testament sentence diagramming to join. And you will find people there who can help you with your questions. There are other things as well on this page, so I invite you to come and browse around. Okay, we're ready to move on to part 2 now. For those that want to take a little deeper dive into sentence diagramming, we will take a look at a particular verse much more closely than the one diagram we have already looked at. What good are sentence diagrams? Let's see what we can find out. Back in Logos, I'm going to open a layout that I've created for Greek diagramming. Since many people watching this video will be pastors or prospective pastors, I thought it would be particularly appropriate for us to work on a passage from the pastoral epistles, so we will be looking at Titus 1:9. I've chosen a passage that is short, where the grammatical structure yields important understanding of the meaning, and for extra value, where the application is weighty. I'm particularly interested in the last portion of verse 9, where Paul speaks of the pastor as being able by sound doctrine both to exhort and to convince the gainsayers. Now that word gainsayer is not an everyday word for us, so let's look over at the New King James Version and see how they rendered that passage. That he may be able by sound doctrine both to exhort and convict those who contradict. So a gainsayer is a backtalker, a contradictor. The meaning, of course, seems clear enough until we look at the modern versions, such as, for example, the ESV. The ESV says, so that he may be able to give instruction in sound doctrine and also to rebuke those who contradict it. Maybe the difference between the ESV and the other versions doesn't jump right off the page at you, but when you get to comparing them closely, you notice that it looks like the King James and the New King James have the contradictors as the one group of people who are the object of both the exhorting and the convicting, that he may be able by sound doctrine both to exhort and convict. To exhort and convict who? To exhort and convict those who contradict. But the ESV says that he may be able to give instruction in sound doctrine and also to rebuke those who contradict it. The giving of instruction and the rebuking are separated from each other more clearly, and those who contradict receive only the rebuke. Well, in that case, who gets exhorted? Well, just think about it for a moment. Everybody gets exhorted, including the contradictors. Everybody needs exhortation, but who needs rebuke? Only those who've done wrong need rebuke, and in the context of this statement, the wrongdoers are the people who backtalk against the exhortation. Now, if you're a pastor who's never had any backtalk from any of your people, not only are you very lucky, you probably haven't really exhorted. Godly exhortation does tend to generate pushback from people who don't want to hear it. And when that happens, the faithful minister goes the next step and corrects that pushback. Now, if you don't think this is what Paul's talking about, just read on, and you'll see that he is talking about false teachers who must be silenced. There are many who are insubordinate, empty talkers, and deceivers, especially those of the circumcision party. They must be silenced, since they're upsetting whole families by teaching and so forth and so on. The context is very much one of conflict and debate. So we do find ourselves tending to take the side of the ESV as to how best to render this passage. But what does the Greek text say? That's what we really want to know, and I'm glad you asked. So we'll take a look, and I'll put it into English word for word the best I can. In order that able he may be both to exhort in the teaching, the healthy, that is, in the healthy teaching, and the ones back-talking to reprove. Of course, that's not the order in which we would express those words in English, but that is the meaning. If I were to smooth that out a little bit, it would sound pretty much just like the ESV. Now, let's pass the cursor over the diagram and click Show Media. And then we'll scroll down so that we can see that last portion. And let's read through this diagram. In order that he may be able, and then that idea of ability is expanded by a series of two infinitives, to be exhorting in healthy teaching. And I have put the two words kai together here in the middle to show how as it's rendered in English, both and, both of those words are working together as a pair of words to join these two infinitives very tightly. So you could think of the first one as meaning both to introduce parakalein, the second one as meaning and to introduce elenkein. So both to be exhorting in healthy teaching and to be reproving the ones who contradict. Now, this both and structure is very important here because that's the key to figuring out what goes with what. When you're reading along and you come to the first kai, I'm using the Erasmian pronunciation. Those who prefer the more natural pronunciation would say ke. When you come to the first of those, that signals that a structure is starting that will give us one item that will extend over some distance of text, and another kai or ke will come and introduce the second in the series. So everything between the two occurrences of the word is the first element in the series, and then after the second kai, you now have the second element that extends as far as necessary to complete the parallel, and if the sentence is long enough, it may go on after that whole set of two concludes. This sentence ends with the conclusion as the ESV renders it. As the King James is understanding the passage in the New King James, actually the sentence does go on after that pair because they understand the both and to connect together only exhort and convict, and then the sentence goes on, those who contradict, that relates back to both of those infinitives, not just the second. Again, in the wording of this particular version, and we'll talk later about how that would be diagrammed. As the ESV is worded, the sentence ends with the conclusion of that second item in the series, and there's no further sentence material that follows it. Now, the reason this is so important to understanding the structure of the Greek is because of where the phrase "the contradictors" falls in the Greek word order. Here's the first of those two kais, both, to be exhorting in healthy teaching. And now, before the infinitive that parallels parakalein, comes the object of that second infinitive, and the ones contradicting to reprove. The placement of the ones contradicting between kai and the second infinitive means that it can go only with that second infinitive, not with the first. And so that's exactly what the diagram shows. The ones contradicting is the object only of elenkein, not of parakalein. Does this mean that the faithful pastor does not exhort those who are contradicting? No, it doesn't mean that at all. Remember, everybody gets the exhortation, including the contradictors. But not everybody gets the reproof. Only the contradictors get the reproof. Now, a good question that some will wonder about is how the passage would be diagrammed to show the construction reflected in the King James and New King James. What if Paul had written about exhorting and convicting the backtalkers? Just before we look at a diagram that shows how that would be diagrammed, let's observe one other thing, though, that the New King James places by sound doctrine at the head of that series of two, so that it also seems to modify both. It seems as though by sound doctrine he is exhorting, and by sound doctrine the pastor is also convicting. So we really have two issues to deal with here as far as a diagramming difference if we were to understand the text the way the New King James and the King James had rendered it. As I've mentioned, I don't believe that is a valid reading of the Greek. It's just an interesting academic question about how you would diagram that way, because certainly there will be passages where you do have to diagram that way. So here's what that diagram would look like. I've put it in English just so we can move through it more quickly. The symbol that shows the pair of infinitives, you can see now comes together on its right end, so that once again there can be a line extending from that point that's common to the two, and that's where you would write the object of both verbs. And then the phrase by sound doctrine is connected on the left side, again, where there's a line that's shared by both of these members of the series, so that that phrase can easily be understood to modify both. Back in Logos again, if you were drawing a diagram of this passage yourself, or if you're reading this diagram carefully, you might notice that this construction for being able is a little unusual. There's a simple Greek verb, dunamai, that is very common to express that idea. What we have here instead is the linking verb, the subjunctive of me, plus a predicate adjective, dunatos, or, if you like the more natural pronunciation, something like dinatos. Is there significance to the particular word choice Paul has made here? Well, I believe that there is. That simple verb form that Paul could have used is over 10 times as common as that adjective that he did use. And when we look at the context where that adjective is used with reference to human ability, we find that most of those contexts warrant understanding it as not just ability, but strength that is ample to its task. Ability may be very marginal, but this word doesn't seem to be used for a marginal ability. It's a strength that is well up to what's demanded of it. The kind of ministry Paul is talking about imposes the will of God on people who are in many cases highly reluctant to yield their own will. It is not a weak man's business. Now, one more thing before we leave this diagram alone. Where does that strength come from? We haven't talked about the earlier portion of the text, but notice that this hina clause is expressing the purpose of the man's holding fast the word. He adheres stringently to the scripture in order that he may be able to have this kind of ministry with people. So the scripture is the source of that strength, not just the strength of his human personality. So, for people who want to think deeply and carefully about the thought connections among the various bits and pieces of which the New Testament's sentences are formed, these diagrams can be a gold mine of help. No, they don't have the last word on every matter by any means, but they can serve as a great conversation partner that I believe many students of the Word will come to value highly. If you're intrigued by the potential that sentence diagramming holds as an exegesis tool and just want to take some baby steps forward, I encourage you to check my website, check out that Facebook diagramming group. Let us hear from you and see how we can be help to you. God bless.